Asserting central dominion immediately, this thrust opens diagonals for the bishop and queen. Embracing the Sicilian defense immediately injects asymmetry and sharp counterplay, setting the stage for complex tactical battles rather than a symmetrical positional struggle. Such a passive knight deployment on e2 feels like a tentative whisper rather than a bold statement, sacrificing tempo and immediate piece activity. Expanding the pawn chain toward the center, too, d6 immediately stakes a claim, preparing for potential. Nf6 and supporting, e5, fostering a dynamic pawn structure. Preparing a fianchetto, this move seeks to control the long diagonal, though it neglects immediate central influence and potentially weakens the kingside's pawn shield. Black mirrors white's fianchetto idea, aiming to contest the long diagonal with a solid pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal pressure, this development subtly contests the kingside's central square control and prepares for a potential pawn storm advance. Developing the bishop to this diagonal locks down the kingside and prepares for potential central breaks. Fortifying the d4 square and preparing a kingside fianchetto expansion, this offers a solid pawn structure against black's aggressive setup. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies control of the d4 square, creating a pawn chain with the d6 pawn and preparing for potential central expansion. Deploying the knight to the rim suggests a patient buildup, perhaps aiming to reroute it to a more active square later, while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn structure. Developing the bishop to this diagonal solidifies control over key squares and prepares for potential pawn breaks, while also offering an escape route for the king if the center becomes too volatile. Shifting the knight from its less active square on a3 to c2 clears the way for the bishop on c1 and potentially prepares a kingside advance, but also concedes central control for the moment. Suddenly, the queenside erupts as black aggressively claims territory with c4, aiming to create a cramped and difficult position for white's knight on a3. This pawn push immediately challenges white's queenside structure and signals a clear intention to seize the initiative in that sector. Opening the center with this pawn push boldly challenges black's queenside pawn chain, aiming to liberate white's pieces and create dynamic play. Exchanging the pawn on d3 immediately grants white a more fluid pawn structure, potentially allowing for easier development of the queen and bishop towards the kingside. Black should consider how this frees up white's pieces and look to exploit the weakened light squares around white's king if possible. Unlocking the queen's diagonal offers immediate pressure against the kingside, but this also exposes her to potential harassment by black's developing pieces. Consider the ensuing development of white's knight. Its placement on a3 is quite passive, suggesting a longer-term strategy for kingside expansion, while black's pawn on c4 now dictates considerable space on the queenside. The knight's journey to e5 immediately targets white's center and opens up lines for future operations. This bold advance forces white to reconsider their piece development and pawn structure. A well-timed central infiltration that challenges white's ambitious pawn push and creates immediate dynamic possibilities. This maneuver actively contests the central squares, disrupting white's harmonious pawn formation and offering black counterplay. The knight's leap forward is a strategic declaration, aiming to disrupt white's nascent queenside expansion. By occupying e5, the knight exerts pressure and potentially prepares for a thematic pawn break or piece transfer. Reclaiming central space after black's aggressive pawn thrust, this retreat allows for a potential kingside regrouping and aims to redeploy the queen to a more active square, perhaps supporting a d4 pawn push or preparing for a queenside development. Developing the queen to c8 aims to achieve central control and potentially challenge white's queen on d1, while also preparing for potential castling. Sharpening the kingside defense with a pawn anchor prevents any immediate dark square threats or bishop infiltrations, a prudent, albeit conservative step given the queenside pawn advances. Developing the knight to its natural square, this piece now eyes the d4 pawn and eyes potential maneuvers towards the kingside, hinting at a future kingside attack. Launching an aggressive pawn thrust with f4, White immediately challenges the central pawn chain and aims to seize more space, potentially opening lines for the rooks and the king's bishop, though it also weakens the light squares around White's monarch. The knight's journey to c4 is a bold repositioning, aiming to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn chain by attacking the d2 pawn and creating a thorn in White's queenside. It's a direct challenge to White's less-than-ideal knight placement on a3 and now on c2 by forcing an immediate decision regarding the pawn structure. This gambit of piece activity over immediate pawn structure integrity could open up lines for Black's pieces, especially the queen, which feels a bit cramped on c8. However, it also potentially weakens the dark squares around Black's king if White can exploit the pawn deficit later. This is a dynamic choice, embracing tactical possibilities. Unleashing the queenside pawns is the immediate objective here, aiming to disrupt Black's central control and open lines for your own pieces. By advancing the b-pawn, you're creating a potential outpost on b4 and forcing Black to reconsider the spatial advantage they've accumulated with their c4 pawn. This maneuver is a bid to inject dynamic play into a somewhat passive position, transforming the structural pawn chain on the queenside into an active force. It's a commitment to active counterplay, acknowledging that simply reacting would cede too much ground. The knight's rerouting to b6 subtly undermines White's queenside pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses around the b3 pawn and opening lines for Black's pieces to infiltrate. Reclaiming the central square, White's queen retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and supporting a potential pawn push, while simultaneously vacating d1 for a rook's deployment. Asserting presence on the advanced d4 square with the bishop now eyes the queenside expansion, potentially preparing to contest the open c-file or even reroute towards the kingside if opportunity arises. Reclaiming central influence, the knight embarks on a journey to occupy a more active square, potentially threatening outpost maneuvers or disrupting Black's pawn chain. Black fortifies the knight's outpost, creating a more secure presence in the center and potentially preparing for pawn advances like e5. Unburdening the knight from the cramped a3 square, White initiates a repositioning that aims to activate the steed, potentially eyeing central squares or even the kingside if the opportunity arises, while simultaneously disrupting Black's coordinated piece play. Reclaiming the center with the queen immediately resolves Black's piece congestion on the queenside, bringing the lady back into the fray and preparing to contest the d4 square, while simultaneously untangling the knights. This knight repositioning aims to untangle White's pieces, seeking active squares and challenging Black's queenside expansion, particularly the influential bishop on c6. The queen retreats, vacating the d3 square and opening the way for White's knight to potentially re-establish dominance on that crucial central square, while also creating a slight awkwardness for Black's light-squared bishop, which now has a slightly more constricted diagonal. The bishop gracefully pivots to a diagonal that, while seemingly passive, prepares to contest the crucial d5 square and potentially launch a future kingside initiative, a patient development that contrasts with Black's rather awkward knight maneuvering. Seizing central influence, the knight now eyes the queenside weaknesses and prepares to challenge White's piece coordination. White's queen repositions, seeking a more active central presence and potentially preparing for a kingside pawn storm, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the d4 square and supporting the knight's presence there. Black aims to untangle their pieces and contest the d4 square, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the knight from b6. The queen's relocation to c7 offers a more active placement than its previous position, potentially supporting advances on the queenside or reinforcing the center. Safeguarding the king amidst the brewing skirmish now takes precedence, anchoring the monarch behind a freshly formed pawn shield, ready to weather any forthcoming storms and allowing other pieces to seek more active posturing. Diverting the knight from the potentially disruptive c5 square signals a shift in Black's approach, aiming to consolidate and possibly launch a counterthrust later on, perhaps to the king's flank. Pushing the b-pawn here creates significant spatial pressure on Black's queenside, aiming to dislodge the knight from its comfortable c5 perch and gain freer reign for White's own pieces. a bold commitment of resources to a restricted central outpost, aiming to exploit the immobility of the opposing knight. Shifting the queen to b3 aims to exploit the slight instability of black's queenside pawns, while simultaneously freeing the d-file for potential piece activity. Shattering the pawn chain's integrity, this capture initiates a dynamic pawn exchange that dramatically reshapes the center, potentially opening lines for white's bishop on g2 while simultaneously relieving the knight's pressure on c5. Opening the c-file now aims to exploit the slight disarray in black's pawn structure and potentially activate the queen. Re-establishing the knight on a more active square, this move aims to regroup and contest the central influence white has gained, potentially eyeing a sortie towards c4 or d5 if the opportunity arises. Commanding the c-file now, white repositions the rook to prepare for a potential clash or to support a pawn advance, subtly pressuring black's queenside structure and hinting at a more active endgame transition. Black finally brings the queen into the fray, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for further action. This maneuver, while seemingly natural, does commit the queen to a somewhat passive square where it can be harassed by white's advancing pawns. Keep an eye on how white responds to this repositioning. They might exploit the temporary lack of immediate queenly defense to initiate a central pawn push or a kingside initiative. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside to challenge black's space advantage. Establishing central influence through the d-file is the immediate priority, as the rook now stands ready to contest the open lane and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Pushing this pawn aggressively encroaches on black's queenside structure, aiming to dislodge the knight and create a potential outpost for white's own pieces. Squeezing the knight to a8 might seem like a retreat, but it paradoxically prepares for a subtle redeployment, aiming to contest the vital queenside squares that white has aggressively staked a claim on. Sacrificing the exchange here is a bold gamble aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure on the queenside and seize control of the now open c-file, potentially leading to a swift attack or creating lasting weaknesses for the opponent. The forced exchange of queens finally simplifies the board, presenting black with a more manageable defensive task, as their king remains relatively safe for now, unlike white's, which could become a target if the d4 pawn weakens. White repositions the rook to the open central file, a classic maneuver aiming to exert pressure on black's queen and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from the current pawn structure. This decision hints at a desire to activate white's remaining pieces and coordinate them for an offensive push, even though the immediate board state appears somewhat static. Observe how this simple repositioning forces black to consider defending the queen's current square, potentially dictating their next defensive sequence and limiting their counterattacking options. The rook now stands ready to support pawn advances or join in a direct assault if black falters. Unpinning the knight is paramount, freeing the piece to potentially participate in the fight for the d-file or even seek refuge on g6 if the pressure intensifies, while simultaneously challenging white's centralized rook. Embracing a bolder pawn thrust, white seeks to shatter the nascent queenside structure and initiate a dynamic central confrontation. Securing the monarch becomes paramount. Castling tucks the king away behind a protective pawn shield, preparing for potential future defensive maneuvers and freeing the rook for active involvement. Unlocking the queenside suddenly becomes white's primary objective, aiming to exploit the potential weakness created by black's advanced pawns and open c-file. Opening the d-file with the rook initiates a crucial battle for central control, aiming to dislodge white's entrenched pieces and create a dynamic advantage. Unleashing a pawn storm to seize central dominance, white pushes this pawn to gain valuable space and challenge black's piece coordination. This aggressive pawn advance aims to disrupt black's queenside setup and potentially open lines for white's pieces. The pawn advances, creating a protected passed pawn, aiming to push the rook from its defensive perch and potentially unravel black's queenside pawn structure. Pressing the advantage on the queenside, this tempo-gaining maneuver aims to disrupt black's defensive setup by forcing a decision on where the bishop retreats, potentially opening lines or creating isolated pawns. Intending to dislodge white's pawn wedge, black shifts the rook to a more active square, preparing to contest the open b file and potentially launch a counteroffensive. A subtle repositioning, this bishop's retreat aims to connect the rooks and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside later, or simply to escape the pressure from black's active queen and knight, while simultaneously bolstering the central squares for future defensive maneuvering. Exploring a new avenue for the knight, this maneuver aims to reposition the piece to a more active square, potentially influencing the center or preparing for further advances. The white queen repositions, seeking to exploit the slightly less defended queenside squares and prepare for a potential pawn advance, perhaps on the b-file or by reinforcing the central pawns. Repositioning the knight to a more active square allows it to potentially harass white's queenside pawns or prepare for a counterstrike on the kingside, though its immediate impact is limited by the solid pawn structure. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside, this rook maneuver signals an intent to challenge black's passive pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses along the c-file. Opening the central d-file with this advance creates immediate friction against white's kingside pawn structure and seeks to untangle black's pieces, potentially opening avenues for the queenside rook to become active along the third rank. Initiating a subtle pressure campaign along the queenside, this maneuver seeks to gradually dislodge the black knight from its strategically inconvenient b6 post, potentially opening avenues for future pawn pushes and piece activity. Fortifying the pawn chain and preparing to challenge the central vacuum now becomes paramount as the e-pawn anchors the position, preventing immediate breakthroughs and potentially creating a springboard for counterplay. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, potentially aiming to crack open lines for the pieces. Shifting the bishop to the flank, a deliberate maneuver, aims to reposition this piece away from the congested center and potentially support advances on the queenside or offer defensive coverage for the monarch on the h-file. Securing the bishop on d3 solidifies the kingside and prepares for potential pawn advances on the g-file, aiming to dismantle black's pawn chain. A bold reorientation of the queen, seeking active post on the kingside, potentially supporting a later pawn push or preparing a flanking maneuver, aiming to disrupt white's currently snug defensive setup. Unleashing the pawn storm forward, white aims to shatter the defensive pawn structure around black's king, potentially creating weaknesses for a decisive attack. The pawn sacrifice on f5 aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's pieces, though it concedes the e-file for now. This aggressive approach signals a desire to create counterplay and avoid passive defense, gambling that the resulting complications will favor the attacker. The king, while currently shielded, could become exposed if white manages to exploit the newly opened avenues. Opening the g-file dramatically alters the central dynamic, sacrificing pawn structure for immediate attacking potential against black's somewhat passive king. The queen boldly ventures forward, seeking an offensive role amidst white's tightening grip, but must be wary of being outmaneuvered by the advancing pawns and potential discoveries. The king steps away from the precarious central files, a sensible sidestep that offers a sliver of breathing room amidst the unfolding tactical storm. Sacrificing pawn structure for a fleeting initiative often leads to deeper structural weaknesses, and this push, while seemingly active, carves a new vulnerability for the black king. Opening the f-file with force, white injects dynamism into a position that had become rather static, aiming to exploit the newly accessible diagonal for the king's bishop and create immediate threats against the black monarch. Reclaiming the initiative on the king's side after white's pawn advance, black seeks to activate the rooks through the central files, aiming to generate counterplay against white's somewhat exposed monarch. Unlocking the f-file presents a potent attacking avenue, aiming to disrupt black's well-fortified king position after the previous exchanges. This bishop's relocation to g7 aims to re-establish its defensive presence on the long diagonal, potentially supporting a future pawn push on the kingside, or preparing for its involvement in tactical skirmishes. The rook's repositioning to the fourth rank aims to create immediate pressure on the light squares and potentially prepare for a rook lift or support an advancing pawn. The queen retreats, seeking refuge from the storm brewing on the kingside and avoiding immediate tactical skirmishes, but this redirection allows white to solidify their attacking structure. Pushing the queen to e1 aims to free the f4 rook from defending the king and potentially prepare for a kingside attack. Although the immediate threat to black's king is minimal given the pawn's shield and black's piece's current defensive setup. Black's queen retreats, seeking a safer haven, but the queenside pawn structure is now deeply compromised, potentially leaving it vulnerable to further incursions along the open files and diagonals. Unleashing the rook's power, this aggressive advance aims to exploit the exposed black king and the newly opened h-file for a decisive attack.